3 weeks before my brother's wedding, my dad handed me a manila envelope across the kitchen table and said, "Don't open this until you're alone." I laughed. I actually laughed because my dad was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of person who communicated important things through post-it notes on the fridge and who considered we need to talk a form of emotional oversharing. So when he slid that envelope toward me, like we were in some kind of spy thriller, I assumed it was a coupon booklet for Canadian Tire or maybe a birthday card he'd bought 4 months early. It was not a coupon booklet. I was 31 years old, working as an early childhood educator at a daycare in Guelph, driving a 2015 Civic with a heating system that had 2 settings, broken and barely, and splitting a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate named Ruth Ann who kept a spreadsheet for whose turn it was to buy dish soap. I was not rich. I was not poor. I was exactly what you'd call fine in the Canadian way, which means you don't complain about it. I opened the envelope alone in my car in my parents' driveway. The sun had already set, and I had the overhead light on, and it took me 3 reads before I understood what I was looking at. It was a letter from my parents' estate lawyer. It outlined the terms of a living trust my parents had quietly established 11 years earlier, when my brother and I were still teenagers. My parents had accumulated, and I want to be very clear that I had no idea about any of this. Just over $9 million. The house, some commercial property outside Hamilton they'd bought in the 90s for almost nothing. My grandfather's life insurance that had been invested and reinvested for decades. A portfolio my mother had built slowly and without fanfare over 30 years of working as an accountant. I was to receive the bulk of the estate, approximately $8.3 million. My brother would receive $200,000. There was a handwritten note clipped to the letter. My dad's handwriting, which looked like a doctor's and a kindergartner's, had a disagreement. It said, "We haven't lost our minds. Read the second letter. Don't tell your brother yet, please." The second letter explained everything. And once I read it, I understood exactly why they'd asked me to keep quiet. My brother, I'll call him my brother because that's what he is, and that's all he is to me in this story, was 28 days away from marrying a woman I'll call my sister-in-law because I was raised to be polite even when I don't feel like it. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is what she'd spent the last 4 years doing, which was slowly, methodically, and very cheerfully rearranging my family. It started small. It always starts small. The first Thanksgiving she attended, she made an offhand comment about how my mom's sweet potato casserole was so retro. That was it. Just that. But I watched my mom's face do something complicated, and then watched her quietly not make the sweet potato casserole at Christmas. Then she stopped making it altogether. 4 years later, my mom no longer cooked at family dinners. My sister-in-law brought food from a catering company she liked, and my mom sat at her own dining room table as a guest, in a way that she'd somehow been made to feel grateful for. My brother didn't see it. Or he saw it and decided not to look at it directly, the way you avoid looking at the sun. She'd made comments about my parents' house, a solid red brick semi in Ancaster, that my parents had spent 20 years paying off, being a lot of house to maintain at their age. She'd started referring to my dad's commercial property as that old building and asking whether they'd thought about simplifying. She'd pulled my brother aside at his own birthday party to have a conversation that he later relayed to me as her just being practical and forward-thinking, which was about the redistribution of what she'd apparently already started thinking of as her future assets. That was the word he used. Practical. She had opinions about everything, and the confidence to deliver them as facts, which is a combination I find exhausting in most people and alarming in someone who'd started referring to my parents' retirement as something that needed to be managed properly. My parents, who had lived quietly and carefully their entire lives, who had driven practical cars and taken one vacation every 3 years and said no to themselves constantly so they could say yes to us when it mattered. My parents had spent 4 years watching this woman inventory their life like an estate sale she was already planning. The second letter explained what they'd decided to do about it. Here is the part where I need to explain something because this is the part that confused people when I've told this story before. A living trust is not an inheritance in the traditional sense. My parents were not dead. My parents are still very much alive and currently arguing about whether to get a second cat, which is its own ongoing saga. What they did was work with their lawyer to restructure their assets into a trust that would transfer to me upon their eventual passing, but more importantly, that established me as the sole trustee immediately. The 200,000 designated for my brother was structured as a one-time gift, payable when they chose. Everything else, the property, the investments, the house, was now in a legal structure that made it entirely mine to manage and eventually inherit. They had done this because they wanted to know what my brother would do when he found out, or more specifically, what she would do. They weren't wrong about what happened next. The weeks before the wedding were surreal. I was walking around with this information inside me like a second skeleton, sitting across from my sister-in-law at bridal shower brunches and engagement dinners and cake tastings, watching her charm everyone in the room while periodically making small comments about my parents' financial situation that were clearly designed to test how much information she could extract. She asked my mom once over lunch whether they'd looked into a financial advisor because she had a colleague she trusted. My mom smiled and said they were fine. My sister-in-law smiled back and I watched her file that away. I did not say anything. I wanted to say something approximately 400 times. I am not by nature a person who keeps secrets. I'm a daycare worker. I believe in communication and emotional honesty and conflict resolution through conversation, which are all things I teach to 4-year-olds and apparently could not apply to my own family. But my parents had asked me not to, and I trusted them. I had always trusted them more than I trusted my instincts, which were telling me the whole thing was about to get complicated. The wedding was beautiful. She had planned it with the kind of precision that I have to acknowledge, even now, was genuinely impressive. The venue was a converted barn in Prince Edward County that cost what I make in a year and a half. My parents contributed significantly. They were asked, not guilted, my brother would later say, which is a distinction I've thought about many times since. At the reception, my sister-in-law gave a speech thanking my parents for welcoming her into the family and everything that comes with it. She laughed when she said it. Everyone laughed. I was the only one who heard the specific weight of that phrase, everything that comes with it. 3 weeks after the wedding, my parents sat my brother and his new wife down in the living room and told them they were planning to make some changes. My mom said it calmly. My dad had his hands folded in his lap, which is what he does when he's nervous and trying not to show it. They said they were transferring their assets into a trust structure for estate planning purposes. This was true. They said that as part of this restructuring, they were designating a one-time gift of $200,000 to my brother and his wife to be used however they liked. This was also true. They said the rest of their estate would be managed according to the trust they'd established. Also true, they did not say who the trustee was. My sister-in-law's expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 4 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was careful attention. The third was a very controlled pleasantness that she put on like a coat. She asked very nicely how the trust was structured. My dad said that was between them and their lawyer. She asked whether the rest of the estate would eventually be divided equally. My mom said the trust was structured as they felt was appropriate. My sister-in-law smiled and said that made complete sense and they were so generous and she was so grateful. My brother held her hand and nodded and didn't ask any of the questions she was asking, which told me a lot about how that dynamic worked. After my parents left, my brother texted me. He said the conversation had gone well and that he was happy they were being so organized about everything. He seemed genuinely relieved. I think he believed the 200,000 was a preview of more to come and that the rest of the estate was a number he'd find out about eventually. The questions started about 2 months later. My sister-in-law began reaching out to me directly, which she'd never really done before. She texted to ask if I wanted to get coffee, which surprised me enough that I told my roommate Ruthann about it. And Ruthann said, either she's figured something out or she wants something, and Ruthann, it turns out, has a gift. We got coffee. She was warm and funny and asked about my job and whether I'd thought about the future in a way that felt exploratory rather than conversational. She mentioned once, briefly, almost as an aside, that she'd encouraged my brother to have a more concrete conversation with my parents about long-term planning. She said she wanted to make sure the family was protected. I said that sounded reasonable. I did not say I know exactly what you're fishing for. I did not say. My parents structured this trust specifically because of conversations like this one. I did not say, the estate is not divided equally. It has never been divided equally, and that is a decision my parents made with full information and clear intention. I said, I'm sure my parents have everything sorted out. She smiled. I smiled back. After that, things started to shift in a way that was hard to describe but impossible not to feel. My brother started calling my parents more, which would have been touching if the calls hadn't been noticeably angled toward their health, their plans, their situation. My sister-in-law began making suggestions, just suggestions, about the house, the property, what made sense at their stage of life. She volunteered to help them with financial paperwork. She mentioned twice a lawyer her family used who was apparently very good with estates. My parents listened. They were polite. They thanked her for her concern. And then they called me. My mom said, I think we should move to the next part. I knew what she meant because we talked about the plan, the whole plan, the part I hadn't known about when I first read those letters in my dark car in the driveway. The part where my parents would find out what my sister-in-law had actually been after. They told my brother they'd received some concerning health news. This is the part I struggled with most, and I want to say that out loud. I'm not proud of it. My parents were not sick. They invented a vague heart concern. Nothing specific, nothing that could be directly fact-checked, just something the doctor wants to watch, and they allowed my brother and his wife to believe that things might be moving faster than expected. I'm not here to tell you it was ethical. I'm here to tell you what happened. Within 6 days, my sister-in-law had called my parents' lawyer's office directly, not to offer support, to ask about timeline. The receptionist, who had been briefed, said she'd pass the message along. My parents' lawyer called her back and said the trust structure was finalized, the trustee was established, and the designated gift to my brother was ready to be released at any time. She asked who the trustee was. The lawyer said that information was private. She asked if the trust could be contested. The lawyer, who apparently had great patience, explained the legal grounds on which a trust can be challenged in Ontario, which are narrow, and said the trust had been established for over a decade and had been drafted specifically to withstand challenge. My sister-in-law called my brother immediately after. I know this because my brother called me 20 minutes after that. He was not angry, exactly. He was confused in the way people get when the story they've been telling themselves starts to have inconsistencies they can't explain away. He said his wife had been doing some research and had some questions about how the trust was structured. He said he just wanted to understand the situation. I asked him what questions. He said she thought it was unusual that the trust wasn't structured equally. I said, did she tell you why she thought it should be equal? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said she just wanted to make sure he was protected. I said, from what? He didn't answer that. I asked him something I'd been holding for a long time. I said, do you remember Grandma's china cabinet? The one that was in Mom's dining room when we were growing up? He said yes. I said, do you remember what happened to it? He was quiet again. I said, it's in a storage unit now. Mom put it there because your wife made a comment about it not fitting the aesthetic at Christmas. Mom didn't want to cause friction. She put her mother's china cabinet in storage to avoid friction. My brother was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I didn't know she'd done that. And I believed him. I actually believed him. Because I think that was the whole mechanism. He didn't know because he hadn't looked, and she had counted on that. My parents eventually told my brother the full truth. The trust, the timeline, the why. They sat him down alone, without his wife, and they were honest with him in a way that I think was probably one of the harder conversations of their lives, because they love my brother genuinely. And this was not about loving him less. It was about having watched someone enter his life and immediately start calculating what came with him. My brother cried. I know because my mom told me, and my mom is not someone who relays emotional information lightly. He didn't leave his wife. I want to be honest about that. He didn't suddenly see everything clearly and walk away. People don't work like that, or at least he didn't. But something changed. I don't know what happens inside a marriage when a moment like that lands. When you realize your partner's warmth toward your family was partly an investment strategy. But I know that my brother started calling my parents just to call them, not to ask questions, and that felt like something. My sister-in-law stopped texting me. My parents got a second cat. They named her Biscuit. She is apparently a nightmare. I still drive the Civic, though the heating works now because I finally took it to be fixed. I still work at the daycare. I still split dish soap costs with Ruthann, mostly because I like the structure of it, and also because Ruthann is my favorite person, and I have no plans to let a trust fund change that. What I think about now, when I think about all of it, is that my parents did something I didn't fully understand when I first read that letter in the dark. They didn't do it to punish my brother. They didn't do it to reward me. They did it because they'd spent 4 years watching someone they'd welcomed into their family approach them like a resource to be managed, and they'd decided that the only way to know the truth about that was to structure the truth in a way that made it undeniable. The money was never the point. The money was the test. The money was the clearest possible way to see who was in the room with them and what those people actually wanted. My dad said something to me after everything settled. He said, "Some people see family. Some people see what comes with it." He said he and my mom had spent a lot of years being grateful for the first kind of people and trying not to be bitter about the second. That the trust wasn't about being bitter. It was about being honest with themselves about what they'd seen. I think about the china cabinet in the storage unit sometimes, my mom's mother's china cabinet, and I think about how it got there through 100 small accommodations, 100 tiny moments of friction avoidance, until the thing was just gone, quietly, without anyone naming what had happened. The estate, when it eventually transfers. And I hope that's a very long time from now, because my parents, as healthy and Biscuit need supervision, will be mine to steward. I've thought about what I'll do with it. I've thought about the daycare and what it would mean to have resources and what I'd want to build. I've thought about my brother and what a relationship looks like when you rebuild it honestly, after something has broken the version that was held together by not looking. Mostly, I've thought about the fact that my parents spent 30 years building something quietly, without telling anyone, without making it anyone else's business, and that there is something in that I want to carry forward. The discipline of building without announcing. The choice to let the thing itself speak. My brother called last Sunday. He asked if I wanted to come for dinner. He cooked. He makes a really good butter chicken. He learned during the pandemic and has never stopped being proud of it, which I find endearing. We didn't talk about the trust. We talked about Biscuit and his new job and whether our parents' neighborhood would survive the next round of property taxes. We talked like people who had chosen to still be in the room with each other, which is not nothing. That's the thing about family that I didn't understand when I was younger, when I thought love was the foundation and everything else was built on top of it. Love isn't the foundation, honesty is. Love is what moves in after, once the structure is sound. My parents knew that. They built their estate on it. I'm trying to learn to build the same way.